We are live.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Octavia Tried to Tell Us Parable for Today's Pandemic. I'm Tananarive Due, and this is Reverend Dr. Monica Coleman. And come on in.
Yes, we are excited to have everyone today.
This has been one of those weeks where I'm so happy to have this space because what a week. I mean, it started just with so much, doing too much, as the kids say.
He did not say, as the kids say. It's been a tough week to be Black in America.
It really is.
Brown in America.
To be human, to have empathy in America.
Yeah.
It's just been a really
and it like weighs on you. Like even if you're not watching the trial every moment, if you're not watching the videos, it just, it after a while it gets a little paralyzing, right? Like you're not thinking as clearly, you can't be productive. How could you?
Yeah, it is. And turning off social media sometimes is not enough, although it is a good start.
Yes. But you just know it, right?
Yeah, what's happening.
At least for you and I, you still have to parent your Black child. You still have to go on an errand, and think about loved ones who have to just go on errands or go to work. And it's very challenging.
And having a 6'5" Black teenage son is not happy making in times like these. And I made a realization. I had an essay on the Washington Post this week. My father wrote one essay and I wrote another because the basically anti-Jim Crow 2.0 campaign used an image of my mother being arrested from the 1960s to try to muster support against a bill in Florida that's trying to make it more difficult for protesters and voting rights and writing about that legacy and how Mom always said that the struggle continues. And I realize that when I see protesters now, and they're all over my social media, and the tear gas and the state displays of violence, threats of violence, even before they get violent and militarized against people, it's very, very triggering because I know my mother had a lifelong injury from the civil rights movement. She wore dark glasses the whole rest of her life after being tear gassed in 1960 as a young person. And when I see more people being tear gassed, that just brings me back to her. So the courage that people have, I applaud it. And if you're not up to it, I also applaud you for understanding what your limitations are, because it is not a small thing to subject yourself to state violence.
Truly.
So anyway,
a great pivot, really, because when we began this series, we were talking about the pandemic, but it's really been a parable for the pandemic and for the politics, we think.
True.
And, we're really looking forward to a lively conversation where we get to talk about what it is not only to teach parable, but what it is to live parable, right? And what it might be, to kind of practice in some of the best ways the lessons from parable.
Absolutely. And we have a very, very, very exciting guest, my former department chair when I was teaching at Spelman College, Dr. Tarshia Stanley. And we're very excited to bring her into this conversation, especially specifically in terms of teaching. Octavia Butler, whether you're actually a teacher, whether you are yourself a student of Octavia Butler as a reader, or you're a student in a class, all of these things apply.
And when we teach these lessons to ourselves, our friends, our family,
Yeah, absolutely.
So just for a little format, we'll do introductions. We'll have our conversations. Some people sent questions in ahead of time. As usual, you can always put some in the chat and we'll try to get to those too. Tananarive loves herself a chat.
I do love a good chat.
So please use the hashtag the social media tag if you're, especially on Twitter, but I see it also on Instagram, hashtag Octavia Tried. There are often really great parallel conversations there. We'd love to know what is grabbing your attention and what you're thinking. So we don't check them throughout, but we do check them after we get off. I get to introduce my friend, Tananarive, and up there. Tananarive Due is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. She's an executive producer on Shudder's groundbreaking documentary, Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. A leading voice in Black speculative fiction for more than 20 years, Due has won an American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, and a British Fantasy Award, and her writing has been included in Best of the Year anthologies. Her books include Ghost Summer Stories, My Soul to Keep, and The Good House. She and her late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stevens Due, co-authored Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. She is married to author Stephen Barnes, with whom she collaborates on screenplays. They live with their son, Jason, and 2 cats.
All right. Well, Monica A. Coleman is professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. She's also an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, an initiate of traditional Yoruba religion. She works at the intersection of faith, culture, and social justice. The author or editor of 6 books and several articles and book chapters that focus on the role of faith and addressing critical social and philosophical issues. Her book, Making a Way Out of No Way, A Womanist Theology, is required reading at colleges and universities around the country. Her memoir, Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Faith and Depression, received the Silver Illumination Award in 2017. Dr. Coleman speaks widely on religious pluralism, religion and mental health, sexual and domestic violence, and navigating change. She lives in a lively intergenerational household where she is an avid vegan cook and a cyclist. And hey, I will introduce Tarshia, if it's okay. Dr. Tarshia Stanley is the Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Sciences at St. Catherine University. She's focused on developing programs and courses that engage the liberal arts and learning process and embrace social justice across the university. I know that is the work for all of us in academia. Stanley was the founder and facilitator of the Mothering Our Daughters Conference at Spelman College, which for 15 years invited girls ages 7 to 17 and their mothers/mentors to the campus to share in the journey to healthier self-esteem. Stanley has authored articles critiquing Black women in African American, and Caribbean cinema, as well as Black female iconography and American popular culture. She edited the volumes, The Encyclopedia of Hip Hop Literature and Approaches to Teaching the Works of Octavia E. Butler. She's the founding president of the Octavia E. Butler Literary Society, and her most recent essay, Shapers of God, Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower and Womanist Theological Practice, appears in God is Change, Religious Practices and Ideologies in the Works of Octavia Butler. Stanley earned her bachelor's degree in English at Duke University. She has her master's and doctorate degrees in English from the University of Florida. Tarshia, I didn't know you went to UF. Hey, Florida.
So again, we encourage you to use the hashtag Octavia Tried.
Absolutely. Let other people know this is going on.
And welcome, Dr. Tarshia Stanley.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
We're thrilled to have you here. And I'd like to just jump off with a question that we like to ask basically all of our guests, which because we were born out of the pandemic, how have you managed and navigated this period of uncertainty, quarantine? Were there some unexpected gifts from it, and also any special challenges?
I think I don't have any complaints in the sense that, I was not a frontline person. I could work from home. My family has been safe. And so I feel as if we've weathered the pandemic in the best way possible. It, of course, has had, psychological and emotional repercussions on myself and everyone. But at the same time, it's going back to your theme of Octavia tried to tell us, I have been a speculative fiction reader since I could read. And so I have always understood that we were coming to this place and anticipated this in many ways. And so in many ways, I'm not surprised at the kinds of things that are going to happen next.
That's scary. What's going to happen next?
and what's in your go bag?
Yes, I have a go bag. And, the thing too is that, having spent my whole life kind of being ready for the apocalypse, thinking that it's going to come and that it's looming. I'm glad to have gotten to a place in my life now. While I have a go bag, I don't necessarily have to go. It's the young people who have to go. Right. And it's they who have to be prepared. I've done my part in the sense of I want to make sure that they have the foundation that they need to move forward. So I'm, and I spent a lot of time as a young person living in fear of what was going to happen, because I read so much, about there was going to be this, the aliens are coming and all of this. And finally, I got to a place where I realized the aliens had already come. And that we were already living in the apocalypse in many ways. And that what we're seeing now is sort of the truth of us having living in the apocalypse. Before it was kind of hidden, but now we see it and everybody knows it. And so it hasn't been such a shift in my thinking and understanding. There's a sadness because I had hoped that we could avoid this. And I still think that we have ways and means in which we could come out of this as better humans.
Well, I agree with you there. We better, first of all, but yes, I do think that there is that aspect of wider awareness, whatever that means. I saw a tweet the other day where someone said, I think we've gone beyond the point of raising awareness for a lot of these problems. But there is that value that more people understand that we are in this slow burn of an apocalypse. And that begs the question now, what do we do? And one thing that's so beautiful about Octavia's work is that it offers real world solutions, in particular in parable.
Absolutely. And I think that, this one of the reasons I enjoyed teaching her so much. And to be honest, I never taught Octavia Butler until after she passed. Because before I read her as that was what belonged to me. And it wasn't something that I did in my daily work. But after she passed away, and I just missed the fact that I wouldn't be getting more of that work so much, I began to ask myself, why are you not sharing this with your students? And isn't it a bit selfish of you not to kind of introduce your students to this work? And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to start sort of bringing her into my space in terms of the scholarly work that I do, and talk with students about her and introduce and let her be the same source of strength for them that she had been for me.
So along those lines, I have to ask, so what books do you teach, or what pieces do you teach, or what are your favorite to teach? What do students love? What do they go, And I imagine it might even be different in different contexts too, depending on who you're teaching and where you're teaching. But I'd love to hear that, right?
Yeah, it is different in different places. And I teach it for different reasons. So for instance, when I taught it at Spelman, it was more of I wanted to teach parable to help students understand that there were different types of leadership, right? That there isn't just business or corporate leadership, that there is that community and leadership that we need so desperately now. We need folks to step up and do what they do best, and to assume their roles. And you don't have to wait for someone to anoint you for that you can step up and do that. And so really wanted to introduce my students to Octavia Butler in that way. So we read parable. But at the same time, and people always assume that parable is my favorite book, which it actually isn't. I really love Wild Seed. And so I love Wild Seed, and can't wait to see that on the screen at some point. I like the, shapeshifters are just, having been a kid, who wish she could shapeshift, so that's always been my favorite Octavia Butler novel.
That was my first one that I read. Yes.
Yeah. Kindred, of course, is taught most often. Probably prior to the pandemic, you would have seen Kindred on most syllabi, but now you're going to see Parable most every place. And that's because students have easier access to Kindred, particularly if they aren't used to speculative fiction. But I think the one that I start with, no matter what, is the short story Blood Child. I start there because I want students to step outside of their comfort zone and know that we're getting ready to do something differently, and to really be prepared for that. And so, of course, when they start reading about, the Telic who deposit their babies in the bodies of humans, and that's where we start, so we can go ahead and get all of their angst out of the way. They're going to be moving into this space that they perhaps haven't been in before.
Can I tell a funny story? Well, I think it's funny. I was at the Huntington exhibit for Octavia's work, which was just spectacular. and they had a bunch of drawings on the wall by third graders and they described it to me as, oh, these are their drawings of the book Dawn by Octavia Butler. Now, some of you may know, Dawn is Octavia's novel about the world post a nuclear holocaust, where a Black woman is basically given the job to pick the surviving humans to go repopulate the earth. But she also introduces this species called the Oankali, and there's a very sexual nature to the relationship between the protagonist and the Oankali. And so when she told me these third graders, and I'm looking at all these pictures of the aliens, and my face was like, and she's like, oh, it was excerpts. It was only excerpts.
Yeah.
Like, you let them read what? Right?
Yeah, I was like, third grade? Okay.
But in a nutshell, there is sometimes, let's just be frank about it. Octavia's work can be difficult in a teaching setting, whether it's the violence of parable, which, is very unflinching when Robledo falls, or the odd sexual component to fledgling with a character who is like, she looks like a child, oh, but she's a vampire, she's actually 50, oh, but in vampires that's still a juvenile. It's like, wait, how am I supposed to, and I've had issues come up at the college level, never mind third graders, with people resisting some of the difficulty, whether it's the violence or her very unique take on sexuality with her characters in some cases. So sometimes we have to walk carefully with Octavia's work.
Mm-hmm. And I think the careful part is just creating a space in which students understand they're supposed to be uncomfortable, that this is supposed to be work. I always say it's not a beach read. You got to work when you
right.
read Octavia. You can't take it to the beach. You have to be prepared to work. And because she wants you to think about what this is really mean, and it's going to ask you to negotiate some new ideas. It's going to ask you perhaps to rethink some of the things that you've always thought were absolutely true. She's asking you to do work. She's not asking you to be entertained. It is entertaining to a certain degree, but it is the work that brings me back to Octavia. And I try to read through certain books every year. And when I was raising my daughter, I would always go into like a depression after I read it. And she would say, why do you do this to yourself every year? And I was like, I have to, because I have to do the work every year to figure out how far have I come? What am I thinking now? What can I push past that I couldn't push past before?
I love that. So I'd love to know, kind of two questions. One, because I had one in mind, and then what you just said. I guess the first one is, what is the one or two that you read every year? And then someone else asked a question that ties into how you're talking about teaching. And that is, do you give like supplemental pieces to go along with Butler, or is it just straight up, her novels? I read through Parable every year. I read through Wild Seed every year. Sometimes I use Fledgling, sometimes Kindred, but sometimes Dawn, and I read the whole series of Dawn. You have to go all the way through. I think I used to teach a course called African Diaspora in the World, and I thought, here's a perfect example of diaspora. If you want to look at what happens to a people who are taken out of their homeland, who are captured, and then they're resettled, and then you want to see what happens in the second generation, it is Dawn. Look at the whole Xenogenesis trilogy, and to really think through those things. But I think the thing that, and really Bloodchild, because that was my first experience with Octavia, I just love to read that story, because I like to go back to when I was standing in the library that day and I discovered it. And I thought, what is this? And who is she? And why have I never heard of her before? That I was just devastated that I didn't find Octavia until I was in graduate school. So those are the kinds of things I go through every year. In terms of supplemental material, I build a course that looks at leadership, and students have to find a contemporary leader and build a web page about that leader. And so they're reading Lauren, they're reading Dana, they're reading
Anyanwu, they're reading these women at the same time they're looking at women who do what they want to do out in the world. And they're trying to think about what are the commonalities here. And they have to build that into their digital expression so there are supplemental readings in the sense that they're reading leadership, women's leadership outside in the world in which we live, along with Octavia Butler. But I don't do a lot of other supplemental things because I don't need to, because you can find absolutely everything you need in Octavia's work.
I love that. One thing I've started doing with my students at UCLA, I teach Afrofuturism there. The Black speculative arts is basically how I teach it. And Parable is the main novel that we're reading for that course. And I have an assignment that's like a mini essay they have to do every other week or so. It's usually about 400 to 500 words. But when we do Parable, rather than writing about just about any aspect of what we talked about, I ask them to create their own Earthseed community and ask themselves, who is allowed in the community? How do you decide who's welcome in your community? And what kinds of imaginary technologies might make and I don't mean like teleportation. It has to be something that is on the horizon, either actual technologies or slightly futuristic technologies, but to really think through not just obviously the events in the story, but what community building is and means, and what leadership is and what leadership means.
And this is so fun to me, right? Because as a religion professor, I teach Parable because I'm like, theology, this is how you do theology.
Right.
It is like, to me, the best book. And look, it's a young Black woman doing it, when most of my students are reading, long dead German white men, right? And so I love it as a model of theological method. Particularly for doing, work in context. I mean, all work's in context, right? But really being grounded in a social justice context. And we had a really fun question. I think this ties into, because we're all teaching this right in different ways, is, if you were to choose team teaching Octavia's work with someone from a different discipline, what would, not the person, but what disciplines would you like to see team teach? Or would be fun to have team teaching her work?
We could teach with anybody. Tananarive and I team taught a class, and
Sure did.
She's as a creative writer and I as a literary theorist. And so, we team taught that class, and our class had to do your regular standard, go do research paper, but they also had to do a creative paper in which they had to do world building. And Tananarive taught them about world building. And so it was really great to pair up and do both this critical and creative expression around Octavia Butler's work. But actually anyone could team teach from any discipline, because that is how well she understood human nature. The book that I edited for the Modern Language Association is called Approaches to Teaching Octavia Butler in the Academy. The reason I wanted to pull that together is because I recognized that there were so many people from different disciplines who were using her work, and we weren't talking to each other. And so I would run into a biomedical ethicist who's doing the work in that class, somebody in a psychology course, somebody in a history course. And I thought, here's literature doing what literature does, what English teachers stand in front of classes and tell you that this is what literature is supposed to do. Out in the real world, it was doing it. Social activists were reading her work. And so you could pair her work with absolutely anyone. And in that particular book, you'll see that there are different disciplines, and they talk to you about what they did in their classes to teach the work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at the questions.
And I'm looking at one in the chat too.
It's related, and more than one person is asking about it. It's clearly on a lot of people's minds. So I think we can bring it up here. Octavia's work could be fairly characterized as somewhat violent. I think that's a fair thing to say, almost no matter what book you pick, whether it's Kindred or Dawn. Violence is a part of the world in Octavia's work. And we're now at the point, Tarshia, you mentioned the upcoming adaptation of Wild Seed, which I know is at work. I believe that's at Amazon with Nnedi Okorafor and Wanuri Kahiu, who did a short science fiction film called Poomsy. And I'm very curious to see what they'll do with that. But now, as a creator, I'm feeling like this sense of unease because when creators do get through the door with Black speculative art, a Lovecraft Country, or more recently on Amazon, a series like Them, there's this sort of growing drumbeat of kind of backlash that the work is, quote, trauma porn, which I think is a very blanket term. And as some have pointed out, almost feels like sort of a conservative stance, like the kinds of things people were saying back in the 80s, being embraced by progressive communities now in the 2020s. But one thing Jordan Peele told my classes when he came is that if you get a note back from an executive, even if you don't respect the note, and they tell you something is too violent, it's not that you have to make it not violent. You have to find a way to make the violence carry some kind of emotional resonance, which is what Octavia does in her work, but which can be difficult for filmmakers to recreate on screen, right? So I guess looking forward with anticipation to these adaptations of Octavia's work, how would you like to see violence addressed in adaptations? It's not really a fair question. Maybe you're not a filmmaker, but I think you probably have some thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. And I think it's because we're so used to violence, right? And I know for me, like, particularly having been, the other side of my world is my film scholarship.
Right. That's right.
A scholar who hasn't seen certain films because I cannot, right? Like I simply can't. I can't participate in that. I don't want to see it. I don't need to see another broken Black body. I just don't want to see it because it's just too much for me. So there are films I have never watched because I don't want to see that. But then there are things in which, but for me, the speculative world allows me to deal with those things in ways I can't deal with them when they're presented more as reality, right? So for me, if I can go into the speculative world, I can take it long enough, I can stand it long enough to do the kind of critique that I need to do. And so I think that's part of what I saw happening with Lovecraft Country, right? And I thought, and then I appreciated it, and perhaps they made it for people like me because it allowed me to go into that space because I could do that. Because the minute I felt like this is way too much, it would push me into that speculative space where I would like, okay, I can transfer it over here.
The imaginary. Yeah,
right. Yes. Absolutely, I can deal with it. So I think, and also for me, whatever these adaptations will be, they will not be the novel.
No,
it is a different text. And it allows me to see how someone else interprets that particular text, which is what my work is every day. I'm interpreting people's text. It's not their text. It might not be what they wanted or what even they would say, but here is my interpretation. So I let it be that, and I don't expect them to give me exactly what Octavia Butler would have given me.
Right.
And I like, given this and, the violence that's there. I mean, part of me wants to say, well, if the world were less violent, the work would be less violent.
Right.
But it's a reflection of the world that we're in now, or that we're in when people are writing. But, one thing I've often heard, literary scholars say about Octavia Butler's work and about other womanist speculative fiction is that there's also this imagined way through or imagined way out. And I'd love for you to say some things about that, because it's kind of how do we practice this, right? That it's not just like it's all horrible, we're all going, to hell in a handbasket.
Oh no, it's so full of hope. It's so full of hope. It allows you to see the horrible thing, but also to see the hopeful thing. And that to me is violence. When you only show me the horrible thing and you don't show me the hope, you don't show me the rose that came out of the concrete, when you don't show me that part, right? And so that to me, I think is works to create a secondary kind of violence. When we can't see a way out of it, there's always a way out. And there's an interview that Octavia Butler did in which she talked about how people would say to her, your work is just so not hopeful. And she was like, no, it's the epitome of hope. That is why I write, because she had such a deep love for humanity and wanting us to do better and be who we could be, better than we could ever imagine. And so it is always full of hope, because it says to us, we can connect at our humanity at some point. And that's what we should be doing. So I understand, sort of the whole, but I also think that some of those critiques around violence don't tell the whole truth, because some of those folks are watching, very violent television on a weekly basis. You know what I mean? Like criminal.
Yes.
And, so, but you can take that violence, but not that violence over here. I think there's a different conversation when we show a Black body in a way that resonates with us as humanity. And that's what I think that kind of well thought out, trying to really tell a story about who we are does. It isn't gratuitous. It isn't just for thrill. It isn't just for the ratings. It isn't just shock value. It is because I want to take you someplace so that you will understand something.
Yeah, and considering the ongoing violence against marginalized communities in the U.S., well, really around the world, but we'll stick to the United States, the ongoing violence that's contemporary and historical, I'm mistrustful, to be honest, of any sort of a forming movement away from showing that violence, because it's even as it relates to movies revolved around slavery, which there haven't been that many, frankly. There've been in like a handful. You can count them on one hand still in 2021. And I understand that it's not for everybody, but it's also very convenient for whiteness to not want to look at slavery. That's why they're not teaching it to our children properly in our schools, right? There was nothing whiteness would love more than for us not to talk about slavery. So we have to find that balance between portraying, validating that history, validating the suffering of our ancestors, not erasing what they went through and what we're still suffering from generationally, because it's not like it went away, but also balancing that with, as Peel said, if there is the outcry against the violence, it doesn't necessarily mean make it less violent. It means make the violence speak to people in a different way. And it might mean shooting it in a different way. It might mean, off screen as opposed to on screen. I mean, there are ways to do it. And I think some of the new creators in the Black speculative film and television space aren't experienced with genre. And I think that's why we're having some of the backlash, is because they're not actually horror creators, but they have discovered that horror and science fiction can also be horror, are tools to unpack this trauma, but sometimes doing it in an indelicate or ham-handed way.
And what is it that you want the violence to do? Because if it's to help you understand what this person has lost or the pain that they're suffering, there may be other ways to do that actually aren't violent. There's a way to tell that story that doesn't necessarily have to violate a body. And so, I think that one of the things about just sort of Black filmmaking in general is that it's still in its infancy in many ways. Having control over what you see, over the writing, over the production, over the cinematography, over the distribution, those kinds of things. That's very new. And so we're still in that infancy and growing up into that space in which we tell those stories. I think in a way, we're going to see much more powerful storytelling, cinematically, because people have such access. They're practicing so much earlier than they would have been able to before, that we're going to see incredible things, but we're just at the beginning of that journey.
Right. So I would just caution, audiences, be careful not to become sort of agents of squashing a movement before it's fully underway. What's interesting is, for instance, The Parable of the Sower graphic novel was just nominated, I think, for a Hugo Award. That was by John Jennings and Damian Duffy. So yay to that. Yeah. And I was a consultant on that. And I was very concerned about how they would portray, because it's different to read about violence and to see it even in graphic novel form. Right. So The Fall of Robledo could be looking all kind of ways that would be, offensive to readers and very off-putting to readers. And I think they did a really good job with it. So. Yeah.
And when I've taught that, and I've taught, Parable, for example, in really different contexts, right? So when I've taught it in the Midwest, right, to predominantly white Midwestern students, right, who were not from Chicago, but were in Chicago to go to school where I was teaching, they were really shocked by the violence. When I taught it in Southern California, people were like, well, that's kind of like where I live right now. Right? Exactly. They're like, the 5 is right there. And there are parts of my hood that sound just like this. And so I always want to say, this is, while it sounds really far away to some people, it's not that far away. Especially those early scenes, right? I mean, the human carcass is okay, right? But a lot of the other stuff is not really so far away for a lot of people. That what is exciting is what is the way out, right? Is this alternative way that we get to see in the midst of it, because some people just have the violence and don't see where the hope is in their actual lives.
Exactly. And when I think about, like, for instance, the way policing is portrayed in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, you know, where the police, if they come, you're going to have to pay them. If they come, they're just as likely to steal from you or hurt you as they are to try to serve you. You know, that is not fiction. You know, I mean, maybe we're not literally handing them money, but Lord knows the city council is inordinate amounts of money to not solve this case and to potentially shoot the victim when they come and respond. And I think the closer you are to that reality, it's not going to seem as violent, because that's just what people are living. That's what we're experiencing vicariously through headlines.
Yeah, I read the Parable of the Sower with my students at St. Kate's, with some of my leaders at St. Kate's. I wanted to have a book club with them, and so we read it. And I remember we came together one very snowy Sunday afternoon, because I thought, are we going to cancel because it's a lot of snow? We're like, no, we're ready. So we get there, and they were so excited because they made the connection between the fires in Parable with the fires that were happening in Southern California at the time. And they said, you know, I just saw that the Kardashians were able to save their property because they could hire a private fire service to come in and fight the fire. And it was like, they were so just thinking, wow, this is happening right now. It was such a moment for them to be able to link what they saw in the text to what was really happening in the world. And it was just, you know, and I just saw these lights go on everywhere in terms of how they began to think differently about the world that they were living in, because they could see it's not far away. You see, it does happen. You see, it does depend on money, whether or not you can save your property and that kind of thing.
No, those are good teacher moments.
Great. Yeah, when the lights
go on.
Oh my gosh, that's the best. I'm trying to think, you know, in my own experience with Octavia, I'll have to think about this question, but I'm wondering, between all of us, what are those moments that have like the most dramatic, like aha moments for your students?
Yeah, I think
that's one. You might have said yours.
Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah. Because, you know, they were all into the Kardashians. So they were like, wow. Look at that. Look at capitalism. So.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Kindred is one, I think, because as you mentioned, Kindred is one of the most widely taught. It's accessible. It's often the book I first suggest, especially to Black readers who've never read science fiction, because it's sort of that bridge. It's like, okay, I know history, I know slavery, I can make that leap. But the interrogation of this notion of a contemporary person being whisked back into the antebellum slavery era, and all of our bravado, you know, about how we wouldn't do that. Well, not me, because I know better, but a lot of people like, I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have been complicit in this. I wouldn't. And then, yeah, you would. It's what Kindred teaches us. You know, I feel like that's one of the biggest lessons from that story is how we're kind of full of it as contemporary people, judging our ancestors in terms of their powerlessness. And how we were all forced to be a part of this horrible system.
Yeah, I think I've been teaching parables. I think the moment is really when, you know, they're on that road north, right? And people are coming in and out of you know, who's going to come in the community and what are the rules going to be? Like, look, you have to get down with this earthseed thing. You don't have to embrace it completely, but you got to be willing to talk about it. You can't hate it. You can't kill people. You know, just that establishment of like, who's going to be in, what are the ethics going to be? What are we going to believe together? And that whole, I mean, it's a process. It's not a particular scene, but especially because all these scenes kind of happen after some kind of issue of violence. Like we rescue somebody, they pick up somebody, you know, and how she begins to reiterate, Lauren begins to reiterate and and for the first time, like it's all been in my head. And now I'm going to try to get people to roll with me. And that's really, I think, the first couple scenes where you see that happen are what seem to grab, you know, because I'm also, you know, I've been training students who are preparing for religious leadership, right? And that's really like, oh, okay. So, because most people kind of inherit the communities that they're in, as compared to this is what you do with a new idea.
Yeah, I think the hyper empathy too really resonates with students, because I've seen students take that opportunity to say it's okay that I feel things really deeply, that it's all right, and identify themselves as, oh, I'm an empath. I'm and just go, and I go, oh, I have so many empaths now in my classes, but it's just so incredible because they feel as if it is okay that I feel things so deeply, and that things wound me or things hurt me, or I feel the highs and the lows. And also that I can understand what you're feeling, and that's a gift in many ways, not a curse, and really allowing them into that space to say, hey, this is something that's valuable, and it's something that I can use in terms of who I want to be in the world.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put, Tarshia, because the hyper empathy syndrome is treated by many of the characters like a disability. But I agree with you that it's a gift. Because without the capacity for empathy, we do not move forward. It just simply is not possible that we personally will have been experiencing every social or capitalist injustice, right? So we have to be able to extend empathy to others who are doing worse off, who are in a worse situation. And I find it so interesting that people who self-identify as conservative have, or at least profess to have, so much less ability to have that empathy, to the point that they feel that those of us who are displaying empathy are faking it, right? We don't really care about poor people. So what's our angle? You know what I mean?
But it's empathy, I think, that's kind of made some of this the movements we've seen the last year almost now different, right? I mean, because more people have been home and online, that, things that felt more further removed from certain communities now don't. And except for those you're just mentioning, Tananarive on the right, as far right or conservative, there have been so many, I think, really moving and important and beautiful displays of empathy for people who are like, this is not me, this is not my community, this is not my culture, but I care.
Right. Well, like the Portland protests, the ongoing, by the way, Black Lives Matter Portland, and I've lived outside of Portland, so those are not mostly Black people protesting. I know that area well. And, that kind of just, this is our country, we can make it better. I didn't even realize the degree to which I was living in a police state until I dared to hold up a picket sign that said Black Lives Matter. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah. I would love to ask you about how you relate womanism and Butler's work. And we have a question about that from someone in the audience, but also, some of the articles you've written. I would love, and I do work with womanist theology. I would love to hear some of your take on, we don't give it away. Everyone's got to go read the article too. Well, give us a little bit.
Well, and again, womanist theology is not my area. It is something I like to read and I like to know about. And so, but I think what led me to this last article was, there are all these book jackets and everything that talks about how Lauren creates a new religion. And I don't think that Lauren creates a new religion, and then they sort of superimpose that on Butler, and that Butler's creating a new religion. I see Butler doing what womanist theologists have done forever, which is to craft the way in which they want to be in that spiritual space and that spiritual practice. So what I do in the essay is I put Butler's work in conversation with Howard Thurman and James Cone, Dolores Williams, and Katie Cannon. And I sort of trace sort of how I think they're talking to each other. And that metaphor of the wall, particularly in Howard Thurman's work, where he talks about men being pressed up against the wall, but the wall for Butler is that wall around the Robledo, and it's on fire. So to me, I see them doing the same things, and that Black people have always done, which is shape God to their own needs. Right. So that's really what it's about.
Well put. Someone is talking about Lilith in chat. Nicole, I see your name. I'll just call it. It's talking about Lilith in chat. And this was something that also occurred to me in terms of activist spaces. A lot more people are seeing the need for activism. We have new people being drawn to activism, but if Butler teaches us nothing else, it's that people who take leadership positions in her novels, particularly women, are going to meet resistance, right? And those interpersonal politics within activist spaces sometimes spill into the headlines. We're seeing it now with Black Lives Matter in the national level, right? So community building within organizations is its own challenge. And I think there are a lot of lessons in Butler's work about that, like staying focused in your leadership, focused on your path, navigating the naysayers. I just feel like there's so much to learn there.
And and I think Lauren's example of leadership, and even Lilith's, is that they can't do it by themselves, right? I mean, they have to cultivate a group of people around them who can help them move the vision forward. I think Lilith is, she's always very uncomfortable for me, in that when I think about the ability of the Owen College to manipulate her nervous system, right? They kind of plug in and make her feel whatever they want her to feel. Like that, I always wonder, and it gets back to that idea of symbiosis that is so prevalent in Octavia Butler's work. Who's in charge? Who's taking advantage of whom? Is it a relationship that can go back and forth? There's always a dominant and always a submissive. And so that's always I read that always in that uncomfortable space, trying to think about, is that okay for Lilith? Is that fair for her? Is that the only way to survive? Is she really her own person if I can make her feel whatever I want her to feel? And really it's the opposite of Lauren, in that Lauren doesn't get a choice, and Lilith doesn't get a choice as well. Lauren feels whatever's happening. And the same thing happens with Lilith, though, is that, she can, Owen College can make her feel whatever they want her to feel. And even she says, I have to sit here and try to think about what is me and what is them. And I think that's one of those really difficult places of work that she's calling us into to help us think about, because it's really a reflection of our society, right? And in terms of how it is that this interdependence, particularly around racism that we have in terms of identity, that if you're not this, then I'm not that. I don't know how to frame myself unless you're this way. And that there's some really important things happening in that space that we need to work with.
Beautiful. You had me snapping my fingers. That was just very well put.
And let's talk about, how much, I remember, how much of this is me and how much of this is them, right? I mean, you can ask that question on so many levels.
Oh my goodness. Constant quizzing. Is it me? Was that my imagination? Answer no. It's not our imagination.
And I would be very blatant honest with you. The place that I apply that mostly is as I think of myself as a mentor, right? And I think of myself as trying to mentor people. And I'm very much an introvert. I'm very much a behind the scenes. I'm very much let me figure out a way to get it done. I don't have to be out in front. But I serve these activists who, have to be, let me get out here in the front with my picket sign or that kind of thing. I'm not necessarily going to do that. I'm going to pay your rent when you go to jail. I'm going to give you some bail, but I'm not necessarily going to be on the front line. I know my part and I'm going to do my part. But I also have to ask myself, why wouldn't you be on the front line, right? Is it because in your having to navigate this racist system, how much of it did you imbibe? How much of it do I have to constantly go back to what is me and what is them, right? What is it that, because I've had a certain level of success in a system designed to make sure that no one has any who's a Black and brown person. So that meant I had to contort myself in particular ways in order to get through this maze. And so is there then something that's changed about who I am? So I have to keep coming back to that space, trying to connect, trying to make sure that it is me and it's not them.
Also well put. And this is the position a lot of Hollywood creatives are in also, because you want to stay true to your vision. I'm sure everyone involved in all these series have what I would consider sort of a pure vision when you go in, but then there's notes from the executives, there's like notes from the directors, and are you getting lost? Sometimes you don't even know.
I mean, in some ways, that's part of what happens, right? In any kind of publishing of a creative work, right? Short of self-publishing, right? Is, even if you're writing, right, whatever you started off with is probably not what you thought you ended up when you end up with. Is like, that's not the book I planned to write, but this is the book that got written, right?
And sometimes that's a very good thing. It needed the nurturing, it needed the shaping, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we're being shifted away from the core of the vision towards something that suits somebody else's vision.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, I think about Lilith, because, you can tell this part, this is the one I struggle with the most, is, because I think about at the end of the first book, she's pregnant, right? And they tell her, so.
Spoiler. No kidding. You should have read it by now. Go on.
Yeah, sorry. But she doesn't get to make that decision. Yet she gets to be a mother. She gets to love that child. She gets to raise up that next generation that actually is going to help kind of put humans back into a space in which they have a little bit of autonomy. And so it's always this give and take, this space in which, like, how much of it is, how much control do I have, and how much do I have to give up? And, so it's just, I don't know. I could talk about that forever, because I just always feel like that's the place that Butler gets me right there. So,
and as you talk about that, that's so much of, in some ways, what it is to live, speaking from my experience as a Black person in the world, though, like, how free do I get to be, and how much do I, have to hold back, rein in silence, sometimes for survival. Right. Sometimes literally just stay alive. And I think of, well, I don't want to parent my child the way my parents parented me and put the weight of the race on them, but maybe I should. Right. But it's not a non-reality either. Right. I mean, so I think that these are our questions, right? Of how free do I get to be? Right. How much agency should I exercise? Right. What is the cost of that if I do? Right. And can we afford certain costs?
And related to that question also, Monica, how much do we and must we sacrifice? Because sacrifice is something that is also so prevalent within all of these heroines in Octavia's work. What they give up, Lauren gives up her childhood to have to sort of be the adult in the community, trying to plan ahead. In Kindred, Dana literally loses her arm, right? So there's this price that I think Octavia is very clear about, while she's teaching us and warning us about the path ahead. She's also demonstrating to us that path will require sacrifice.
And it's going to change you and bend you into shapes that you didn't necessarily want to be in, but also that unexpected shape might get you to the next space that you need to be in. So,
yes, right. Just the right shape to fit through that opening.
There we have our shapeshifter, right?
Yeah, there you go.
I wanted to ask, I guess, talking about getting us to the next place. We have a question about, should we leave? Right. I mean, we know that Octavia's like, let's go to the stars. Like, we need to roll out. Like, this whole earth is unredeemable. But there's a question asking you in particular, given that we know, is there a worthwhile future here? We don't, we know Ms. Butler didn't think, Octavia Butler, the person who wrote Ms. Butler, right, didn't have a lot of confidence in the entire planet. But, do we have any reason for that confidence, given what she's telling us? Or is there somewhere we can go?
Yeah, I think that she did. I think that's why she wrote, because she was trying to put us in contact with that ability to redeem ourselves and to redeem the planet, that we have it. We made this world. We can make another one. We can do that. We have the power to do that. I think about the Industrial Revolution. I thought it only took about 100 years to knock this thing almost off its axis. So we must be pretty powerful overall. So we certainly can undo or redo. And as a person who I said loves speculative fiction, I mean, I was a little kid waiting for the Enterprise to come pick me up. I mean, my family thought I was crazy. I was like, no, they're coming. And, because my people are coming, because you all are not it, but my people are coming. And that's how I felt as a kid, because I just felt so out of place. And I thought there must be another space. But I think now that if we can't get this one right, we still have to take ourselves with us wherever we go. And so Butler comes back to that hierarchical need that she saw in humanity. And she says, that's the problem, that no matter who we are, Black or white, even within, different ethnic groups, there seems to be this need to put one person over another, one idea, one thing over another. And that is where we have to go to. That's what we got to get to and figure out why we do that and what do we do about that. And if we could do that, then I think she saw us as having a different kind of future.
Well, hopefully we can do that.
If only we had improved her worst expectations.
It's kind of hard coming out of the last 4 years, in particular 2020, and have any kind of burning faith that people can react to evidence right in front of their eyes, that we can overcome denial, which is also something that runs strong in a lot of Octavia's work. But like, Angela Davis said at a conference I attended a few years ago, in order to work for this better future, we have to believe in it. So evidence to the contrary, in terms of human capacity for change quickly, to open our hearts to people who don't look like us, to not be ruled by fear. We still have to believe in that future. And Octavia definitely did. And I agree with you. That's why she wrote her books. If she hadn't believed we were capable, she wouldn't have bothered trying to tell us.
Yeah. She believed in humanity and our capacity to do better. So
absolutely.
Yep, absolutely. So I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't believe it.
Amen.
Well, we are a little tight on time, but I really want to ask you about the Octavia E. Butler Literary Society. And if you'll tell us a little bit more about that as we head out.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Yes. The Octavia Butler Literary Society, first of all, is open to absolutely everyone. So you don't have to be an academic to be in a society. And in 2013, I started thinking about, I'll tell you the truth about why I founded the society. I love Octavia Butler. And I was next door to my colleague who was president of the Toni Morrison Society. And we would get in the hallway and start having these arguments about who's the better writer, who was doing what. And I was like, Butler was really doing this before Morrison. And then she would go, no, it's not. And so, and I thought, I can't let her have a Morrison Society and I don't have an Octavia Butler Society. So I called in the scholars at the time who were doing work on her, both of whom have passed on now. But, so I called in to meet with them and ask them, will you help me found this society?
Including the late Dr. Gregory Hampton. I have to shout him out. I'm so shocked to lose him.
Yeah. And so Greg and Consuela Francis, and who did the book of interviews, the first book of collected interviews of Butler. And they both met me in Boston at the American Literature Association. We filed all the paperwork, and began to just invite people to come into space with us to talk about Butler. And that's what we did. And so we have a gathering every 2 years. This year it was virtual, hosted by St. Catherine University here in St. Paul. And we had almost 1,900 people register for the Octavia Butler Literary Society, and just hundreds of people online for each of the sessions. It is different from a regular literary society in academia where we just sort of deliver scholarly papers. We do that, but we also invite community members in. I call them community curators. So we invite community curators to come in and work with us and think about what kinds of events and activities do people who are reading her work in the community want to participate in. And so what we did this time was we would have an academic panel, we'd have a community panel, and we went back and forth for 2 days and we sort of communed together. And we, as always, we had our Saturday night ending was with, we had a personalized concert from Toshi Regan, who came in because, she's the librettist for the Parable of the Sower opera. And she did a personalized concert for all of the people who were in attendance at Butler Society. So anyone can join. It's OEB Society, .com.
I just put it up in chat for those of you looking for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just started a book club. And so if you want to meet with us every month to read an Octavia Butler book or talk about a book you're reading, you can do that as well. And so that's the society. But we really wanted to be at the crossroads of the community and the academy, and to really create that space, because that's what Octavia would want us to do, is to create a space where everyone could come in and join one another.
Beautiful. That's great.
And again, if you can tell us a bit about your work, Tarshia.
About my work now?
Yeah, the approaches to teaching the works of Octavia Butler.
Oh, sure. Yes. So, and then if you would like to see, I have a collection that I edited. It is from professors in the academy who teach Octavia Butler's work from different disciplines. And so the book is really about how they teach Butler in their classes. And so it's really, I think, and we've written it in such a way that everyone can have access to it. Because again, I don't want to produce anything that can only be read by theoretical scholars. I want everybody to have a chance to read the work. And so I recommend, if you want to see how we're teaching her in a university setting, then the book is called Approaches to Teaching the Works of Octavia Butler.
Fantastic. So this is the portion where we tell you a little bit about the offshoot of these Octavia Tried to Tell Us webinars, which is a separate group called Saving Ourselves, Shaping Change Workshop, which, unlike these sessions, we don't have a guest. Monica and I run it, and you get to share your stories and faces on screen. We talk about the 7 steps of Octavia's method of shaping change, an ongoing discussion of Octavia's work and influence, but also as it relates to our personal lives in a slightly more personal way. There's a Shaping Change e-journal that we've designed with Octavia's principles of shaping change in mind to keep us focused and feeling refreshed as we go forward in our weeks. More interaction with me and Monica, a social media group that helps us build community. And for a sign-up bonus, there's a recording of an interview I did with Octavia Butler. Tarshia, you heard this interview back in the year 2000, which was a peak moment for me in terms of being able to really ask her about her work. So if you want to know more about the Saving Ourselves, Shaping Change Workshop, you can learn more and register at www.octaviawebinar.com. This has been a fantastic conversation with Dr. Tarshia Stanley. So thank you, everybody. Value your presence here, and really glad you were able to make it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's so glad to have you and have this conversation.
Thanks a lot.
And Tarshia's book, one more time, someone is asking the name of your book, Tarshia?
Approaches to Teaching the Works of Octavia Butler.
Yes, Approaches to Teaching the Works of Octavia Butler, which is great. So check it out. Get in chat too.
Great. Until next month.
Thank you. It was good to see you, Tananarive.
Thank you, Tove. So good to see you. We have to catch up.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
All right, great.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.